I moved into my new apartment a few months ago. It was nothing fancy, just a small one-bedroom on the third floor of an old building. The kind of place where you nod politely to your neighbors but don't really get to know them. There was one neighbor, though, that stuck out to me almost immediately. A guy who lived directly across the hall. He was quiet. Too quiet. I never heard his TV, music, or even his voice, but I'd sometimes hear odd sounds coming from his apartment at night, like faint scratching or the shuffle of furniture being moved. One evening, I was heading out for groceries and saw him at his door. He was tall and gaunt, with sunken eyes that darted around like he didn't want to make eye contact. I greeted him casually, but he didn't respond. Instead, he gave me a quick, almost fearful glance and slipped inside. The weirdness didn't stop there. Sometimes I'd find things out of place in the hallway. Small scratches on my door, or a faint, wet footprint near my welcome mat. I chalked it up to the building being old and damp, but it left me on edge. Then one night, as I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone, I heard a soft knock on my door. It wasn't the loud kind of knock you'd expect from someone who needed something. It was hesitant, like whoever was knocking didn't want to be heard. I got up and checked through the peephole. No one was there. The next morning, I noticed a small piece of paper folded and wedged under my door. It had one word scribbled on it: leave. The note shook me, but I tried to brush it off as a prank. Maybe one of the neighbors had too much to drink and thought it would be funny to mess with the new guy. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had something to do with the strange man across the hall. That night, as I was falling asleep, I heard the noises again. But this time, they were different. The scratching and shuffling were louder, almost frantic. I got up and pressed my ear to the door. It sounded like it was coming from his apartment. I debated calling the landlord or even the cops, but before I could make a decision, the sound stopped. The next day, I ran into another neighbor in the hallway, an older woman who'd lived in the building for years. I casually asked her about the guy across the hall. Her face immediately darkened. "It's odd," she said, lowering her voice. "Keeps to himself. People say he's been here for over a decade, but I've never seen anyone visit him." Her words lingered with me. That night, I decided to stay awake and keep an eye on his door through my peephole. Around 2 a.m., I saw movement. The man came out of his apartment, dragging something wrapped in a black tarp. He paused in front of my door, and I froze, holding my breath. He stood there for a moment, then slowly turned and continued down the hall toward the stairwell. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I called the landlord and demanded to know what was going on. He sounded uncomfortable, but finally admitted that the man across the hall had a history of complaints from other tenants. Odd noises, strange smells, and, worst of all, missing pets. That was all I needed to hear. I packed up and moved out by the end of the week. A few weeks later, I checked the news out of curiosity. A body had been found in the dumpster behind my old building, wrapped in a black tarp. The police had arrested the man across the hall. I don't know if he knew I was watching that night or if I was just lucky to leave when I did. But I can't stop thinking about how long he must have been standing outside my door, and what might have happened if I'd opened it. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It's the kind of place where people take pride in their lawns, where neighbors wave but rarely speak beyond small talk. For years, everything was normal, almost boringly so. Then the house next door, which had been vacant for months, got a new occupant. The first time I saw him was when I was taking out the trash. He was standing in his driveway, staring at my house. I waved, trying to be polite, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, watching me. Over the next few weeks, I noticed strange things. He didn't seem to have a car, but I'd hear noises late at night, like heavy footsteps pacing in his house. Once, I thought I saw him standing in his front window, staring out at the street at 3 a.m. I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe he was just a loner. Then there were the packages. I noticed a steady stream of deliveries arriving at his house, large, heavy boxes. One evening, I watched from my window as he dragged one inside. I couldn't see what was in it, but the way he struggled made it clear whatever was in there was heavy. One night, I came home late from work and found something odd in my backyard, a small pile of dirt, freshly dug up. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was an animal. But the next morning, there were footprints leading from the pile to the fence separating our yards. I decided to confront him. When I knocked on his door, it took a long time for him to answer. When he finally did, he only opened it a crack. His face was pale, and his eyes looked almost hollow. I tried to keep my tone light, asking if he'd seen anything strange in the yard. He didn't say a word, just stared at me before shutting the door without explanation. That night, I couldn't sleep. I felt uneasy, like someone was watching me. Around 2 a.m., I heard something. Soft tapping on my window. I froze, too scared to look. The next morning, I found scratches on the window frame, as if someone had tried to pry it open. I called the police, but they didn't seem overly concerned. They said it was probably an animal or some prank. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to my neighbor. I started paying closer attention, watching his house whenever I had the chance. He rarely left, but when he did, it was always late at night. One evening I saw him dragging something out of his house to his backyard. He was moving quickly, looking around nervously as if he didn't want to be seen. I grabbed a flashlight and waited until I was sure he had gone back inside before sneaking over to his yard. In the corner of his yard was a new hole, hastily covered with loose dirt. My heart raced as I uncovered it, and I froze when I saw what was inside. A black plastic bag. The smell hit me before I even touched it. I ran back to my house and called the police. They arrived quickly and began investigating. It turned out the bag contained animal remains, thankfully not human, but the officers seemed just as disturbed as I was. The next day, I noticed his house was silent. No pacing footsteps, no sounds of movement. The police must have spooked him. But then, that night, I heard it again, tapping on my window. This time, I forced myself to look. Through the glass, I saw him, standing just outside, staring at me with a blank expression. I grabbed my phone and called 911. He didn't move, didn't react, just stood there until the police arrived. When they searched his house, they found more buried bags and a room filled with disturbing photographs of the neighborhood, photos of people's backyards, windows, and even some of me in my house. He was arrested, but I never found out why he did it or what his intentions were. All I know is that he had been watching me for weeks, and I can't shake the thought of how easily he could have done something worse. Even now, months later, I still wake up in the middle of the night, expecting to see him at my window again. When the house next door finally sold after months on the market, I was relieved. Vacant homes can make a neighborhood feel eerie, even in a good area. The new owner moved in on a Monday. I saw the moving truck early that morning, but I didn't see him until later that day. A tall man, middle-aged, with a serious expression. I went over to introduce myself. He opened the door just a crack, barely enough to see his face, and didn't shake my hand when I offered it. I chalked it up to him being shy or tired from the move. Strange things started happening soon after. At first, it was minor. Lights in his house flickering late at night. Muffled noises that sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor. I didn't think much of it until I found footprints in my backyard one morning. They led from his side of the fence to just below my living room window. I tried to dismiss it, but I couldn't. A few nights later, I woke up to a faint tapping sound. I thought it was coming from inside the house, but after checking every room, I realized it was outside. My heart raced as I peeked out the window. I didn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The next day, I decided to install security cameras. When I mentioned it to a neighbor down the street, she gave me a weird look and said, "I'd keep an eye on the new guy. Something about him doesn't sit right." A few nights after setting up the cameras, I got a notification on my phone, motion detected in the backyard. I opened the app and froze. On the screen was my neighbor, standing just outside my back door, staring up at the camera. I called the police immediately. By the time they arrived, he was gone. The officers searched the area but didn't find anything. They told me to stay vigilant and let them know if it happened again. The next morning I reviewed the footage. My neighbor hadn't just been standing there, he was holding something, a crowbar. That evening I noticed his house was dark and silent, as if he wasn't home. I decided to check the footage again, just in case. What I found made my blood run cold. Around 2 a.m., the camera by my front door showed him walking up to my house, but he didn't knock or try to break in. He just stood there for several minutes before walking away. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called the police again and showed them the footage. They promised to look into it, but said there wasn't much they could do, unless he actually committed a crime. That night, I barricaded my doors and stayed awake, listening for any sound. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside my window. I didn't move, didn't breathe, hoping whoever it was would go away. Then I heard the doorknob rattle. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. Before the operator could answer, the sound stopped. I looked through the peephole, but no one was there. The police arrived quickly and went to my neighbor's house. After knocking several times without an answer, they forced their way inside. What they found was horrifying. His house was almost empty, but in one of the bedrooms, they discovered a wall covered in photos. Photos of me. Some were taken through my windows, others from inside my backyard. They arrested him that night. I learned later that he had a history of stalking and had moved frequently to avoid being caught. Knowing how close I came to being his victim still haunts me. Even now, with him behind bars, I double-check my locks every night. I don't think I'll ever feel completely safe in my own home again.